Aria Mildice began caving in 2017 while working as a park guide at Carlsbad Caverns National Park. Since then, she has participated on numerous expeditions in Lechuguilla Cave, as well as Cueva Cheve, the High Guads, Carlsbad Cavern, the Grand Canyon, Fort Stanton, and Fisher Ridge. This summer, she moved to the rainy Pacific Northwest to work at Mount Rainier National Park. Last year, Aria spent over 1/5 of her year underground. With that, I'll let you take it away, Aria.
Cool. So kind of fitting to do the Near East at the very end. In 2019, we did the first expedition to the lower Near East in over 10 years. The last one was in 2008, and there are a handful in the early 2000s. And then before that, kind of the Learn era in the 90s. So during our expedition, we kind of worked on these areas that you saw there. And this is a little out of order, but it's going kind of in order of where the map is. So underneath Apricot Pit, we had seen the EEE passage, as well as High Tides. Both still had some leads right off the trade route, right off the bottom of the ropes there. And the Andrich expeditions in the early 2000s, Elvis, had done a climb, and they had done a couple leads in this area as well. But we want to just kind of finish it off. So going into High Tides, like I said, the map showed some kind of leads going. They didn't look super promising. But once we actually got into that room, Sean Lewis and Mary Hicks realized that half of the room wasn't really drafted and hadn't really been sketched before. So they completed the room. The room's actually about twice the size that it was originally thought to be. It kind of ducked under a ceiling ledge. And there are still some delicate leads in that room, like what is in that picture there. And then the EEE passage hadn't been visited since its discovery in the late 80s. It had a handful of leads remaining. There was one area that said it had a climb. I went up it, stuck my head in, definitely did not go anywhere, got too tight immediately. And then Doug Warner found a lead going off the side that ended up going into a handful of shots, tight, kind of vertical-ish, break yard, boneyard section. And we kind of got to the end, and they were like, okay, we're done. You know, we don't see anywhere else. And as the sketcher, I say, well, what about over there? So we go, and there's a 7.5-inch squeeze, also requiring narrow shoulders. I fit through, Arena fit through. Unfortunately, Doug did not fit through. And we went through that for about 2 hours before meeting back up with Doug back in the main room. And at the end of that, once we got back and plotted the data, we found that we were about 50 feet from passage in the west near Deep Secrets and underneath Great White Way. So that was pretty exciting. And still going leads in there. There's air blowing in there. Just some more awesome pictures. There's a lot of aragonite in that area, a lot of frost work, very decorated, very delicate. So then going from Apricot Pit, kind of right in that area, there's also the Goa Passage. And Rod Horrocks, who's the cartographer for the area, had mentioned that area and said that there was a couple blowing leads there as well from their trip in the 90s. And we decided to revisit that. Unfortunately, none of the leads really panned out. But fortunately, again, there was just this beautiful frostwork everywhere. And Arena and Doug got some awesome pictures back there. One of the main kind of aims for the expedition was to recheck this northern edge. As we've been hearing from other presenters, kind of trying to make our way up towards Big Manhole has been a goal for a very long time. But we were also trying to make our way towards the Deep Rift. Sean Lewis had done some trips in the Deep Rift that had a lot of air coming out of them. We didn't really know where they could have connected back in. Some of them were kind of headed in this direction. So just to double check again. We didn't find anything super exciting, but we did do a climb above the throne room in a pancake passage. And this is kind of looking into the gates of Nirvana here. But the pancake passage kind of lines up just like above it at a little bit of an angle. There's still a handful of leads going off to the north. Some of them needed to be kind of redefined, whether their location was wrong. A lot of them were clean, and at that point in the week, we were too dirty to feasibly do those without creating too much impact. But some of them are right on the trade route. And in some of those earlier rooms, Emperor's Throne Room, there's leads right in the floor, 2 feet off the trade route. So there's still a lot of work to do. And I would expect that a lot of this Near East map will fill out a lot more. Raton Dome it's about a 5-minute walk from camp. So that is super nice, especially as you're getting later in the week. Most of the travel in the Near East is pretty close. The furthest travel right now is only about an hour away. So something that's 5 minutes away is even nicer. There is a possible climb, and that is about 60 feet off the floor right there. And that room has numerous kind of windows going into this main room, Raton Dome here. So it's possible that we could connect back up to it. There's actually a tiny little hole right here that pops out somewhere up over there. So that might be an easier way to access that. Definitely some exposure though. And there's still a lot of leads remaining in this area. It's entirely covered in this white moon milk crinkle blister kind of thing, and very sharp and grabby in a lot of areas. We made a lot of connections. You can kind of see this kind of beige, this tan color right here, and that is extending off of Raton Dome into the GFX passage right there. And I think we made 3 different connections to that passageway, which did not show any leads previously. And I would expect that we'll connect a couple more times. It's just a complicated kind of black acid raft maze, which I'll show some pictures of shortly. So these are those famous rusticles. They are actually right in camp, like right on the other side of camp. Camp is not known for being very spacious or pleasant. Camp is about 3 feet tall for the ceiling. It's the smallest camp in the cave and can only accommodate 6 cavers. And there's rust protruding out everywhere. The Orange Bowl, we had to travel through on many of our days. And as you can see, has this really striking paleo water line. You can see Mary and myself there. And moving on into another room. And yeah, that's its real name. The cartographer had requested that it be resurveyed. The original map had maybe 2 or 3 rocks in the room. And as most of us know, that's rarely the case for real. And there was also a bad loop right in the area, had a high angle shot that we wanted to redo with distos. And there were some promising leads and notes from other expeditions saying that there were going leads in the floor of another room. So this is another room right here. You can again see those pancake passageways. I think there's 5 or 6 different levels of pancakes just visible in this picture here. And we completed the resurvey from Snowfall Hall, which was a couple hundred feet behind us there, into another room, and then up behind in the other direction towards the rescue route. And another room is also right in the middle of the rescue route, and we added that to the map as well. And we found a new maze area that we named Witch's Brew. This was underneath another room. This was in another pancake passage. And so there's these numerous pancake passages. At their upper elevations, they have that moon milk, that hydromagnesite, popcorn, some aragonite. In general, very small. These are maybe 2, maximum 3 feet tall between each of those pancakes. But as you get into the lower elevations, you get into this black acid raft maze type area. And so you can see a lot of these acid features. This is like a pothole here, all of this Rillencairn and Spitzcairn left over, and with that dark black coating on it as well. And many speleogems, very sharp and dark, as you can see around Doug and Sean in one of the more spacious areas there. So this also has a handful of going leads. A lot of them are tight. They're very sharp. The blackness just sucks up all of your light. Arena and I actually had some difficulty navigating back, even with our flags, just because it was so porous and difficult to see through everything. But we left a T-junction that had a good amount of air, and this is headed west off of another room. So the Witch's Brew area, another room's right here, and Witch's Brew kind of extends off into this direction right here. So that's fairly exciting as well. And we, from another room, traveled then down into the Stud Lake area. And Stud Lake had seen numerous other expeditions traveling through there. They had done plenty of work before, especially on the Andrich expeditions, on the Elvis expeditions in the early 2000s. So we were just kind of finishing up, doing some mop-up, and we also wanted to do some resurvey while we were there as well. So those fissures, there's 3 north-south trending fissures. Stud Lake is on one of them. And then those 2 other ones are a bit smaller, more narrow. And there's only 1 more lead remaining. And we didn't do it because it needed a 70-foot rope, which is somewhat unusual for the Near East. Most of the travel through the Near East doesn't actually require bringing your vertical gear with you. It's quite cushy. You can walk everywhere nearly. And Stud Lakes, we heard a little bit about that earlier from Dave Bennell. You can just barely see the back of Stud Lake there. We measured it to be 128 feet long from the near shore where this picture is taken. We're estimating that it's about 35 feet wide, although it sounds like Dave can both speak to that and its depth better. But this is potentially one of the larger bodies of water by volume in the Guadalupes, both surface and subsurface. And in future years, we are continuing this survey, but we'll require a pack raft. And I eventually have plans to hopefully lead an expedition to dive both this and Lake of the Blue Giants again, and get some survey line and sketches in there as well for the cartographer to complete the map. So East Bull Passage was kind of the end of the Bull Passage there. You can see that old map in the lower left corner. And then the new sketch there. I unfortunately don't have a copy of the newest map. So we've just got the sketch in this case. And you can see this room has high ceilings, 40-foot, 30-foot ceilings. And the room itself is about 150 feet by more than 50 feet wide. From both of these maps, Stud Lake comes off in this lower right corner and heads to the south. So with those 3 kind of north-south trending fissures, they do line up directly with some survey stations in the upper Near East, which have not been visited to my knowledge. John Lyles might be able to speak on that a little bit better. But it might be interesting. There's a couple climbing leads, both above Stud Lake and kind of in one of those other parallel passages there. And it would be interesting to see if we could get like a light connection or a sound connection or something like that. Stud Lake is one of the higher elevation areas in the Near East. And when you get into that lower elevation, 1,200 below the surface or so is when you're seeing that black acid raft areas. In the early 2000s, the Elvis expeditions also resurveyed the Moby Dick room. as well as Aragonite Mare headed off to the right, to the east on this map. And then they also did a lot of survey in the Grapes of Wrath area in here. And it's a maze with over 100 stations now, so one of the bigger mazes in the lower Near East. Future plans, there's a lot of work to do, a lot of resurvey to be done. As Hazel was showing with hers, kind of these beginning expeditions have a much more resurvey heavy load. And a lot of the bowl passage, the whole bowl passage needs to get resurveyed, and that'll be a couple 100 feet. And Great Beyond is a really interesting one as well. Sean Lewis and myself noticed that when we put it in Breakout, which was a 3D kind of modeling software created by Andy Edward, it actually lines up with the Western Borehole. So if you can imagine the Great Beyond headed that way, and the Western Borehole heads off down that way. And the Great Beyond, reading some of the old survey notes, looking at some of the notes, there is maybe some leads, hard to say, but there is some mention of air in some of that breakdown as well. So that could be interesting as well. And unfortunately, as we were plugging in the data, a lot of this old data is potentially suspect, as a lot of us are finding out. And this big loop that goes around the entire Near East right here will likely need to be eventually resurveyed with or replaced with new survey. So we have that upcoming as well. So going up to the upper Near East, Ben Tobin has this section now, but this was a map from 2003 from Paul Berger. And John Lyles probably can speak on this, again, more than I can, but I'll take a shot at it. So if John wants to jump in or folks have questions, John's probably the better one to answer. I've been on a handful of these trips. From Apricot Pit, there's been an effort to resurvey and do a lot of work out towards Ghost Town. And the main way to get out to Ghost Town is through S&M Crawl, which, as you can tell by its name, is really pleasant. Everyone really likes this route. It's not sharp. It's not terrible. You definitely do not need to crawl through this pool of water right here. It's very large walking passage. You know, the scale here might look weird with this bag and it only being maybe 8 inches tall, but that's just an optical illusion. As you can see, there are some places to sit up while we sketched, but mostly not super pleasant. So we resurveyed it in 2018, and that fixed some loops in the area. But John Lyles and teams also rediscovered the bypass to the S&M Crawl. And much of that bypass is through kind of corrosion residue passage. It's not a belly crawl the whole way, but it is much dirtier, a lot more corrosion residue, especially as it hasn't received as much traffic. A rope was rigged across one of the slopes to make it a little bit easier. That's definitely the preferred route to get out there now. Going forward from S&M Crawl, that bypass kind of is up in this area, not entirely shown on this map. And going from S&M Crawl, that bypass comes back in right in this area. There's a big triangle piece of flagging, big junction there. And you make your way down towards Hoot and Holler Hall. We resurveyed Hoot and Holler Hall pretty recently. There's a couple leads, including in some pancake passages. There's a couple climbs in there. And Apricot Dome also starts from there. And the Near East is a little interesting. It has these 3 big dome pit structures, Apricot Pit, Apricot Dome, and Aragonite Mare, that connect that upper level and that lower level in 3 vertical locations. So Apricot Dome hasn't been visited in some time. I know John has traveled some ways down it from the top, and I have heard that it has quite a bit of rock fall, so it might be interesting to actually resurvey that one. And going over to the H survey, Ghost Town was resurveyed in 2006. So teams have spent a couple expeditions doing the H survey. You can see the birthday column here, and they made their way to the end of the H survey, where they found a connection to the Far East. So this H survey, you can see on this line right here, and from that line, this GYE survey there is the top of Rag Nightmare. And some people call that room the echo chamber. It's at the bottom of the rope that goes up to Stairway to Heaven. And it is right through these super delicate formations right there. So could be, it won't be ever a travel route because of how delicate it is. But it is another interesting thing that this cave has kind of opened up for us. And lots of pretty stuff in the ghost town and H survey, Soda Lake area. You can see Garrett Jordanson and Aaron Lynch sketching along the H survey there. Lots more formations again, very decorated, compared to especially the other parts of the upper Near East, which are mostly corrosion residue, breakdown, some sponge work, crawlways, things like that. And so that's the Near East. Does anyone have any questions about anything? Definitely thank you to all the cavers who've worked in the Near East. As you can see by that left picture there, Dwayne is very dirty, and Mary there in the right picture is having a lot of fun in camp. So it's definitely a unique branch, a lot of work still to do, a lot of resurvey, and I'm hoping a lot of new caves still to be found since most of it hasn't been visited since the 80s or 90s.
Thanks, Aria. So I have some questions for you. So as a new expedition leader, what did you, what happened that you didn't anticipate when you first put an expedition together?
Oh, I was exhausted. You kind of spoke on that on yours, and everyone gets back to camp, and everyone's getting ready for the next day. Beth talked about that, and you're getting water, eating dinner, those sorts of things, and the expedition leader is pouring through all the notes, pouring through the map, writing up the trip reports, and then figuring out what we're all going to do for the next day, figuring out the teams. And kind of putting that all together is just a whole extra layer of work.
What advice would you give to someone that was trying to, because you're a relatively new member of the expedition team, what would you recommend to someone who's interested in becoming involved in Lechuguilla?
Yeah, I think a lot of people touched on having really good fitness. I think that's definitely one of the bigger things to open up longer trips and create more opportunities for yourself. Of course, knowing how to survey, being really proficient with vertical, knowing how to rig, like any extra skill that you can add is going to make you a more well-rounded caver. And just kind of getting as much experience as you can, going and doing as many vertical caves or, as many vertical problems as you can, practicing surveying, even if it's just a tiny 50-foot long cave. All that time and effort, goes towards something and helps.
Great, thank you. And also there were a lot of questions earlier on about the rope replacement project at Lechuguilla, and you're one of the people that's been leading that. Could you talk to that project?
Yeah, so the park in recent years has decided to replace ropes on a 10-year basis, especially ropes that are well-traveled or on trade routes. And so a lot of those ropes were replaced in the last couple of years on regular routes to camp. And so all the ropes in the Rift area, the entrance area, Boulder Falls, all of those have been replaced by numerous different teams. And there's also been an effort to replace the ropes on some of the bigger pits. So Great White Way was rope replaced last year, I believe. Apricot Pit was in the plans for this year, but of course with COVID this year, that didn't happen. And we also got Aria Nightmare, which had some ropes on it from the 90s. And the rescue rope at the top of Aria Nightmare was possibly from 1993. I don't know if that's the exact date on it. So I'm gonna show how young I am and say that that rope is older than I am, and I definitely wouldn't want to use it for a rescue. So that was also replaced. And then the Gorilla Pit ropes, one of them was from 1989. We replaced those going from the upper far east Grand Guadalupe Junction area down into the Ruby Chamber. But yeah, most of those ropes were from the 80s and 90s, and cavers are regularly traveling on them. And so once we've taken them out of the cave, they were sent off to Ron or to PMI to get tested. And I believe Ron's going to talk about that a little more tomorrow.
Great. And then what about the way that you're changing the rigging now that you're putting these new ropes in? Are you doing any kind of new bolting or using different anchors? Are there any lessons learned for the old ropes that you're using to incorporate into the new project?
Yeah, in some cases, the rigging has changed slightly. I think the biggest example, James helped put in a chain at one of the rebelays on Aria Nightmare. There was numerous stories and issues of this rope rubbing, and being such a rub that you wouldn't see it unless you looked behind the knot. So there have been kind of small changes just to reduce rub. There's been a couple new rope pads, things like that. I know when we were going to do Apricot Pit, we were going to change the traverse a tiny bit because there's a rub that core shot the rope when I was actually traveling up it after this Near East trip. So small changes here and there to move a little bit away from the indestructible rope technique.
Okay, and I'm just looking, is it, so the suggestion here is that you make team members write their own trip reports to save you time at camp. Do you have anything to say to that?
I did force my team members to write their own reports. They can tell you how strict of a dictator I was. I made us do full 12-hour days of survey because a lot of the objectives were so close to camp. So I'm sure some of my expedition mates, my teammates, can speak to how rough that might have been for them as well.
And then there was one more question. Do you know how many ropes there are to get to the camp in the Far East?
Oh, more than 20.
Okay.
I mean, going down more than 20 from EF Junction. So even more from the entrance. You could give me some time and I could figure it out. I would estimate, though, you're going down from the entrance to minus 1,200 feet, coming back up to about minus 700 feet. So that alone right there is a huge amount of rope work.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Aria. Appreciate it.